All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to host Dan Yamins and Clement Kotar here at the Redwood Center. They came all the way from Stanford here in person. So thanks, guys. And so they're going to talk about their work, world modeling with probabilistic structure integration, or PSI. And before we dive into details of that work, we're going to talk a little bit about the high-level motivations and kind of like, the research interest and trajectory and that kind of stuff. So let's get started with that. Actually, I'm going to start with you, Clement. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your research interests, and how did you end up working on this project?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a computer science PhD student with Dan. Dan's lab is a little bit quite interdisciplinary. So there's
Hmm.
people that are the neuroscience side and the cognitive science side, and some people that are like doing very AI-like things. So I was working on like robotics and computer vision things in my undergrad, and in like I was at this Allen Institute for AI
Hmm.
that's doing research work, and then I was very interested in Dan's work on building world models in general and sort of doing a little bit more um, cognitively inspired, in terms of the capabilities of the models.
Hmm.
And so I ended up working with him at Stanford, and we ended up building basically consecutive generations of um, world models, and particularly ones that allow you to do a lot of really good physical control
Hmm.
that are not based on the sort of traditional paradigm of just training like text video pairs, but allow you to do very precise manipulations is sort of the type of things that you imagine you could do in your mind.
Hmm.
And then I'm very interested in the applications of those to robotics, but also as just tools for studying how these like processes can be even done
Hmm.
computationally.
Thanks. So I guess one theme that is going to come up in this the conversation today is that, you know, um, Dan's lab is called Neuro AI Lab. There's neuro as well as AI. And from your description, it sounds like you're mostly coming from the AI side.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we are. I think that like the fundamental theory, some of these models has like a sort of not constraint, but like inspiration of neuroplausibility in the sense that like we don't really view it as constraint. We view it as, well, if it's possible to do it this way, there's like a way to do it this way. So I think that the amount of data we train on and some of the procedures we do are like sort of within the envelope things you might imagine that like humans sees in their lifetime. Um, and I think that there's been work like mapping our models, and especially some of the things that second paper you sent, Kai's paper, that
Hmm.
has been you doing a version of these models
Hmm.
on like exactly strictly like toddler first person view
Hmm.
data, and then much more cognitive and neuroscience studies of it. So
Hmm.
we sort of view it as developing, like the highest. It's like I think Dan and I've had this conversation many times. So there's like several stages of approaching neuro AI problems, and first stage is like find a problem that like we know that biological organisms can solve,
Hmm.
but AI can't solve yet. And
Hmm.
then like the neuro AI goal and just pure AI goal are the same thing, which is just make it
Hmm.
work.
Hmm.
And then the second stage is okay, let's try to like get the data diet to be the exact right data diet through the projects like Baby View for Mike Frank's child like first person view data.
Hmm.
And then after that, you can sort of think about even more detailed mapping and stuff. So kind of doing this first phase of like making something that humans can do, but models couldn't do yet.
Hmm.
And that,
Hmm.
through Dan's work, has shown to be a very good like initial signal for kind of like developing plausible models, and then sort of move it on to mapping it closer and closer to the neural thing. So, yeah.
Exactly. Trying to dissolve the boundaries. Makes sense. All right. Dan, let's now talk about your trajectory. So you started, I guess, I'd ask you to just tell us a little bit about the trajectory, but from outside, what it seems like, you started by making these goal-driven models to explain neural data, and then it starts from supervised models, evolved into self-supervised ones. Now in this psi work, there's no neural data, right? So it seems like if I didn't know about this other work that you put on archive 4 days ago, the zero shot world model, I would have was like, okay, it seems like you're moving on from caring about neural data. So can you tell us a little bit about the evolution of your research interests?
Well, there never was any.
Really? Okay.
So, like, I mean, if you look at the work that I did at all of the stages,
Yeah.
tool-driven modeling, the whole theory is that you build the model to do some task,
Hmm.
And then only ex post facto, once all of the parameters have been set, compare it to neural data. It's like a 0 parameter model in some sense. So that's another way to say that is the data was never used to build models.
It was never a data-driven model.
It was never, yeah. So it's only so therefore the goal, like it's like a very simple procedure. Solve AI tasks, compare the brain, and it's that same procedure over and over again. So why was I inspired to do so? Exactly what you just said. At first, we started with supervised networks because that's all we knew how to do. And then it was like, well, we know that like we need two things from an AI, one from an AI perspective, the other from a brain perspective. Babies and monkeys don't get millions of labels. And also, we would love to be able to use all that from an AI side, we use all that non-labeled data. So again, as the two problems were the same. There was something humans could do that the models couldn't, and we wanted to do it from an AI perspective. So let's solve that. That's where the self-supervised models and all the work toward doing that came from. Still no neural data. Just let's do something that brains can do, people can do, that models can't. Let's figure it out. And this is just the same thing. Okay, like the PSI models do stuff that humans can do that previous models couldn't, and that's good from an AI perspective. And we hope it will be helpful from a cognitive and neural perspective. And the Kai's paper is an example of something like that being useful from at least a cognitive point of view, pretty well. And it's the same procedure over and over again. It just takes a while, right? Like I would say that like the process of you solve a hard AI task and then compare it to neural data, right, is a research strategy that each cycle takes some time. So supervised, self-supervised, and now world models, or whatever we want to call this type of thing, is the next generation of doing that. And so for me, it's the same strategy, but my strategy never involved doing anything. I mean, actually, I kind of like the data-driven model idea too, and I'm pursuing that as like a separate research line.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Okay, in my lab, but that happens to just be like, I mean, look, you want to solve two things. You want to do AI and you want to solve the brain. And sometimes those, mostly, like the strategy that I normally take, that I've just described, that's them going together, like basically perfectly together. But of course, there's also a strategy that tries not to care about that. And so data-driven models are just optimized. You got a bunch of neural data and you optimize to match the neural data. That's also a good strategy if you care about brain problems. But I like that strategy. I'm fine with that. In fact, I'm happy to work on it. But the strategy that I've normally taken, which is the data, the kind of the goal-driven or task-driven, or it's really theory-driven. You have an idea of what a theoretical concept of what the brain does, and a theoretical concept of how to implement the thing, and then you build your theory, and it extracts an artifact, an AI artifact, and then you compare it ex post facto to the brain. That's the theory-driven direction. I like that, and that never needed any neural data, and I'm continuing to do that. So you can think of this as like the cycle of that.
Thanks. So the core philosophy has not changed. It's just the particular techniques or the types of networks you're developing or the objective functions you're putting on there has evolved.
In some sense, suppose we solved all possible vision tasks, then you might solve some other domain. And here it's like, okay, well, we started with the ability to solve some vision tasks, not others. And that, self-supervised networks broadened that spectrum because you can suddenly use the data for many other things and more of it. And this is more like that. This is just more of that at some deep level, basically.
That makes sense. So you also mentioned data-driven models, and I coming from this side of being a little more sympathetic with theory, but not really. My background is physics, so I didn't really care about data, never. But I've started to appreciate that it's a necessary step, right? You have to extract phenomena and facts from data, and these big models, the AI models that people are applying, that is very useful. I have come to recognize that.
Well,
But
they haven't been useful yet.
In theory, they should be. But
Well, they
yeah.
Right?
See,
so like it's actually really hard to do the data procedure because you need a ton of data.
Yeah.
So actually, I'm going to share a slide.
Sure.
Okay. Sharing is not turned on, so I sent a request so I can share. Okay, great. So I'm going to share. Great. And so, okay, so like, here's two pathways to getting brain models. Okay. Bottom is like a representation of a general model. Okay. So you can optimize for neural responses. That's data driven. This is red path. And red path is you optimize for neural responses, and then you basically do neural applications like solve neural diseases, neural control, BCI, whatever. Or you can optimize for some goal, some task, or whatever, categorization or self-supervised or something. So let's take your blue path, like what is going to end up being test driven or goal driven or theory. It's kind of a theory, right? And then it's like, okay, and the ultimate thing that you would do from that is just say I, basically. That's the obvious thing. But there is transfer, top-down kind of transfer, where you basically solve the task and it turns out the internals look like the brain. That's basically what I've usually done. Or you can, of course, transfer the other way. Maybe you get like task performance on neural networks optimized for brain data that solves those tests. Like, duh. Okay. The blue path has actually ended up being much more easy because you don't need a lot of neural data. And also, the brain is highly constrained by behavior. If the brain weren't constrained by behavior, blue path wouldn't work. But because it actually is constrained by very tough behavior, strong behavior, blue path works well, and in fact turned out to be, when I first started getting to this game as a whole, I wasn't sure whether blue or red path would be the right way, right? So then, like, in my initial work, we basically did both blue and red path, and I found blue path was better. So, like, I kind of went down the blue path mostly. But in my original work on this, I actually did both, and it's in the papers. It's just that the results are better from the blue path, and I call it blue path because like the dots were blue, and like in that original figure, the red type dots were red. So like that's why I've always thought of it as these two paths, and like I color it this way in my mind. But of course, what you really want is like purple, which is basically, and this is actually what people are going to end up doing. Anytime you see anybody building like a brain model, a data-driven model, what they've actually done, especially for like large vision related ones where you have to be good at something, is first you optimize for task, and then it's pre-training, and then they like train a little on the neural data, and so it's kind of mostly purple. It's like kind of bluish purple, right? And I think that's actually like a great strategy if you're interested in brain data. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this is very clarifying. But you said something quite spicy. Let's explore that. You said that the data-driven ones have not yet been very useful. Why do you think that is?
Because, okay, mostly people are working in vision, and in vision, the theory is incredibly amazing already. The task-driven theory, like the best existing, like I'm going to call like basically the theory. Here's a decent theory of the vision system is Dino V2. Dino V2 or V3 or whatever. That's like there's an architecture, there's a loss function, there's a data set you would train on. You don't need to know anything about the data, so that's your theory. Then you go and take it to the data, and it's like almost perfect. So the bar is so high that for data-driven models to be better than that, they would actually almost probably have to do something impossible. So like it's very likely, at least in static image processing, that data-driven models don't have any room to be good. But in other domains where you don't have a theory, it's going to be great. So I think it's like.
Do you think it might have? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Perfect in what sense?
Numerically, like the predictions are at the noise ceiling of the observable data.
Okay.
So I think that's another point of contention, right? The variance explained that is proposed and considered by consensus the target, like in things like brain score. But there are people who disagree with that, and
I just think on any metric, like I don't really care what the metric is. All the metrics mostly go together. They all go together for interesting deep reasons. But basically, the metrics travel together, and different metrics have different noise ceilings. But like, Dino V2 is close to the noise ceiling on most metrics that I'm aware of. You just have to change the noise. Like most metrics have lower noise ceilings than say linear regression metrics. But so the absolute predictivity is lower and the noise ceiling is lower, and usually the ratio is about the same. So, but like basically, like I guess we have a deep theory of what the right metric is, but this thing we call inter-animal transform. But like, which indicates something that's neither exact, none of the existing metrics exactly, because it's sort of hard to compute. But I don't think anything I'm saying depends that strongly on the metric.
As long as there's some reasonable quantification, you're saying that for vision, at least, Dino crushes all of those metrics, and therefore
it's just like it's just like, okay, yeah, let's look at this picture. Okay, so each dot here is a neural network. This is actually an interesting thing. It's a little beyond what I was saying, which is actually the x-axis is predictivity with high quality MRI data, and the y-axis is predictivity with high quality electrophys data. And so what are we seeing here? It doesn't matter which recording modality you use. You basically get the same result across all the models. Like you basically have the right rank order across all the models, and like you're close to the noise ceiling, like on both metrics. In fact, you're a little closer to the noise ceiling, the dotted line on the electrophys measure, because you've got more stimuli there. So you can like make the mapping a little better. So it's like, I don't know, like basically that it's like really hard for a data. These are all theories. I mean, the upper right model is right over too, right? So it's just, it's pretty hard to be better than.
Well, so I guess this is very, very at this point becomes really philosophical, but what does it mean to understand the brain? Like, does it if you predict it well, do you understand it? So there's this debate that is ongoing in
models are understandable in two senses. One is the theory is like you constructed the theory. So you had to come up with the constraints.
Yeah.
And so that's the level of understanding that approach. What are the constraints that lead to the system? It's like, let me just give you a very brief analogy. You guys have seen like complex fractals, like Mandelbrot or whatever.
No.
Yeah, let's just look at it. Okay. Like, I don't know, Mandelbrot set or something. Okay, yeah, so right. So let's look at that image, right? Okay, right. So like this is a very easy image to understand in a certain sense because it's constructed through iterative operation of an incredibly simple rule. So in the sense that the sense of understanding that we give with theory-driven models is the sense in which we understand an image like this. We have very simple constraints iterated very easily to produce a model. So you understand what the constraints are. Now, of course, the same thing is true. Like it's true here. Like, if you wanted to like give like I don't know like a pixel level description of this thing, you could like have some trouble, right? Because you're going to be like, I want to say exactly what the image looks like at every location. Well, okay, that's going to be hard. And the same thing is hard with the neural networks, right? Because like they're literally both the product of simple iteration of simple rules. In the case of this thing, it's the iterative of the constructive fractal. In the case of like neural networks, it's like the learning rule that's iterated over it's like a very simple learning rule with a simple architecture, simple loss function iterated. And the final losses that like final parameter construction again is complicated, but it's simply generated and we know what the generators are. So now the question is, can you do reasoning in the space of the generators and constraints? And the answer is yes. That's why AI works so well. It's because AI scientists understand the results of their constraints. If they did not understand how to use constraints of the kind that we're saying is the understanding of the brain to think about how to think about things, you wouldn't have rapid progress in AI. You talk to an AI scientist, what ends up happening is they like understand the constraints. And when there's something is not working, they're like, oh, I see, that means we should change this. And they're usually right, which is why they are able to make such fast progress. And that is like understanding that is so powerful that they can like act on it extremely effectively.
Okay, if I want to rephrase this, can I rephrase this because I think this is beautiful. You're saying that understanding here means in a generative, constructive way, you put loss plus architecture plus learning rule, and it generates plus data, exactly, the fourth ingredients. It gives you something complicated, but then you understand it because you know how it was generated. And in this particular view, validation or variance explained on neural data is not the target. It's just a validation. It's like a side effect. Yeah.
I want the models to be accurate. And I have an understandable theory for getting them. I have a way of constructing artifact without looking at the data, but based on my knowledge of what I think should happen.
Yeah.
And then ex post facto, I can check if it's correct. Like it's like it's a quantum field theory. It's not like you like run the quantum field theory in your head. You like do whatever the quantum field theory tells you. It's some complicated stuff that happens to be formulas that you can get there some of the time, but sometimes not. And then you like compare it to some fairly downstream thing to check if it's correct. Right? So, it's like that same thing, basically. Now, in the case of optimization based models, the like ability to generate the conclusion doesn't come from doing math. It comes from doing iteration with the computer. But it's the underlying construction of the theory. It's like it's like some quantum field theories are like, for example, lots of like derivations of wave functions for complicated for like small molecules. Like I don't mean atoms, I mean small molecules are so complicated that nobody can solve with the Schrödinger thing. And so what they do is they simulate the wave function, and then they check it against with measurements. And but the fact that you can't solve the Schrödinger equation doesn't mean that it's like not understanding. It's just that your original field theory is the correct thing. You get the prediction through the compute essentially what it tells you what the wave function should look like, and then you go measure ethylene or whatever molecule you're interested in and see if it's correct.
Yeah.
And it's correct. So
Yeah.
you have a good theory, right?
But importantly, you have a theory. So I was contrasting this idea of discarding that theory, that little, short string that gives you this model, like, this architecture, this losses data, whatever. If you discard that and just go for like, let's explain this neural data. We throw a lot of parameters and data at it and just let's max it. In that case, prediction does not mean understanding. Yeah. Yeah.
Understanding.
Yeah.
But it's still really useful because we care about the outcomes of like brain models for like brain
I see.
diseases.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's extremely important.
Yeah.
Right?
In an applied sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is incredibly, it's like, that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, in a way, it's like the reason I was the blue path was good because it gave us predictive models.
Yeah.
And if there's another path that gives you predictive models even better, good too. So,
Okay.
like it happens to be the case that the blue path is theory driven, which means that it satisfies some urge, at least for me, for understanding, but not for everybody. But actually, even if you don't get the understanding, but you get the ability to solve depression or something, I think that's extremely valuable. So I think we should be open to both things at this point.
Okay, so it clarifies a lot. So I was going to ask you, your lab's name is like Neuro AI Lab. Can you define what that word means to you? I guess we talked about it a little bit, but like concretely, can you define that word?
Well, for me, it just means doing AI models and using them, doing AI stuff and brain stuff together.
Okay.
So but there's a spectrum there. There's like the doing AI.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
We do some of that. When I got to Stanford, I wasn't going to start the AI lab.
Yeah.
Right, obviously.
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to start the neuro lab.
Yeah.
I mean, I did both, so I put both in the name.
Okay.
But practically, what we end up doing is we do a bunch of AI because it's interesting. And it tends to be human constrained in the sense that we would like to have models that we think would be able to solve tasks with human types of inputs, like the paper that that we archived the other day. But there's the part of it that's just doing AI. And then there's the middle of the spectrum, which is something. Okay, so it's
there's a question in the chat.
I guess I can show this, which is basically. And I should say this talk is brought to you courtesy of this new animal.
Oh, congrats.
But anyway, there's these three things, right? Like cognitive science, neuroscience, and AI. And we end up doing a bunch of each one of these things, and they're all kind of related to each other. But actually, the process is this really, which is we think of cognitive science as kind of a target, which is you want to be able to learn from the type of data that actual people get. It doesn't tell you how to solve it at all. Okay, and then but it's like a target, so it's constrained in that sense, and it should. So that's the value of thinking of what Kai's work was, is basically showing that we could hit that target in some way. Okay, and then AI is the actual work of building networks, which is a lot of what we do, and then it's hypothesis generating tool for neuroscience, which you can check. Is it a theory? It's like a theory generating tool, hypothesis generating tool, and you can check if it's correct or not. This is kind of the path we do. But notice I don't really go back in the other direction. Okay. However, if you actually do data-driven stuff, it does go back in the other direction, except not via understanding. It does it via data, which is a totally reasonable thing. In principle, if you actually had a completely correct model of the brain, you want to be able to do lots of task solving. Now, whether that's a fast way to get to that rather than doing the AI work directly, but instead measuring the brain and then getting AI model from that's another question entirely. Right. As in the way that I work now, it's mostly the theory-driven direction. Actually, we don't go back in the other direction because the neuroscience data is not generative of theory.
Exactly. It's exactly one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I think this is probably not just me, and other people might be wondering this. So this is, I think, something quite important to get at. I'm gonna be honest. I might be wrong, but I think, in my opinion, neuroscience experiments, neural data, has not contributed a lot to things that would eventually help us with AI.
Not for 50 years.
Right. Yeah. So Hubel and Wiesel probably, and some other stuff. Yeah.
Discovery of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
And discovery of massively neural network in the brain as sort of massive parallel computing. It helped. Yeah. It helped people recognize how you might do parallel processing in a computer, and that there was another model besides the von Neumann. When I think after the von Neumann architecture, people were confused about how you could do things like parallel processing. So when it started to be clear how it might happen, because the brain was doing it, and you could see that there were like hierarchical retinotopic organization for image processing was very clarifying, I think, for people. And it was like, this is how you might even begin to do parallel processing, right? And actually, these seeds of that were already there in the like television engineering work, because even before neuroscience, actually, people had to, when they were building televisions, they had to like deal with the fact that like the signal was corrupted, and they had to like do circuits. And so they would build television engineers. They were like electrical engineers. They build basically things like filters and stuff. So like the original filter banks were actually not derived by anything in neuroscience. They were derived by television engineers, basically, who needed to like execute those things. But those difference of Gaussian models eventually sort of clearly were confirmed by and brought to the fore as like a main computational metaphor through, I think, some of like neuroscience work, which then like led to like people like Jay McClellan writing books like Parallel Distributed Processing, those PDP books. Basically, like when they were writing, it was like before those ideas, it was like not at all obvious how you would do this. And I think the neuroscience data did help with that. So, but since then, I think it's been pretty sparse, because almost once you have the right language, you kind of don't need the blueprints of somebody else's building anymore. You just start drawing. And I think that's kind of where we are now, which is that we know how to the right basic language to be thinking about cognition in, which is neural networks. And we don't need to see some other detailed blueprint to be able to hypothesize how to do things and test them fast.
Right.
Okay, I just want to note that Hadi does not speak for the entire journal club here, because I think neuroscience is quite helpful, actually.
Okay, let's hear it from you, Eli. How has it been helpful?
All right, so I would say, firstly, by actually indicating that we need to think in terms of energy functions. And secondly, in motor control areas and decision-making areas, brains are still miles ahead of machine models. I really think that, when people say, oh, we've pretty much solved, the visual cortical pathways like this, we're searching for our keys under the lamp in that case. And I say that acknowledging that, it's easiest to record, and we have the most trained experimentalists in the visual cortical pathways in mouse and macaque, but that doesn't actually mean we've solved the brain or something, or that we don't need neuroscience anymore. It means that we've stopped asking questions that are hard.
Well, I think that's, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I'm just saying that if you look at the state of experimental neuroscience and the kinds of experiments that are being done, I personally don't see how they're going to help us. They don't reveal something like some new fundamentally like new phenomenon or algorithm that you can extract from those data, so that can put it on your models. So that point does
I
not
mean, maybe they don't
contradict
because
yours.
I would say maybe they don't because you're analyzing the data wrong.
Let's take motor for
It's
example.
possible, yeah.
I mean, I think that like, so what it's clear that we haven't solved the brain, right? Like, I shouldn't doubt. I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job in static image responses in vision, which is a very narrow thing. We've clearly not solved all of cognition or AI. But let's take motor for example. When motor is good, like for example, like being able to get motor system, like an AI system, to be able to like open bottle tops and learn the kind of motor control that an 8-month or 9-month-old can get is totally unsolved. But I guess there's a question of which path do you think is going to get there faster? People doing robotics with world models, or people measuring neuroscience of motor neuroscience? And like my money is on the first one. So I don't think the neuroscience is going to solve that problem. I think the other thing is going to solve that problem. But it's not all solved here, certainly. At any given time, there's lots of things that are not solved. The question is just what's going to be an efficient path to solving it. And like 20 years ago, I think if there was an argument to be made that maybe visual neuroscience would be an efficient path to solving vision, but it wasn't. And I think the same is true everywhere else. Because, and I'll make the point around the data analysis, the question. I think you're quite right. I think like people don't know how to analyze the data right. but like, let's work through the pathway of what it would mean to know how to analyze the data. Knowing how to analyze the data right means having a model of the data. And as soon as you have an idea for how to build a model of the data, if you're interested in solving a task, you can just go check whether that model concept solves the task. You don't even need the data.
Maybe
So
for just validation, like the little,
might be,
step.
a little validation.
Yeah.
If you're interested in like
Yeah.
taking AI for like its ability, neuroscience for its ability to solve AI problems, and your way of thinking of how it's going to happen is I'm going to get data, and I'm going to analyze it, then I'm going to have an idea for how to solve the neuro side, the AI task. I'm going to short circuit that path almost every time, which is once you start formulating the idea for how to do the data analysis, throw out the data, don't even look at it, and just check whether your idea solves the task. And that's actually just as efficient path. And so you can, like, the data doesn't help you there. Like, if you need to come up with a pretty complicated model to analyze the data, an idea, and you have to implement it, well, just go implement it and check whether it solves the problem. And in fact, that's, I think, what happened. When people build like better confidence or something, when Yamakun and those guys started to build confidence, they were inspired at some very basic level by the neuroscience, but they didn't need the neuroscience data to go check whether confidence helped solve vision problems. It would have been like a basically just like detour at that point. So I think that's the efficiency, like short circuiting that I see happening everywhere or a lot of places, from the connection between neural ideas and AI. And like, I think that's a devastating argument for like the utility of neuroscience to solve AI. On the other hand, neuroscience and brain data is incredibly important for brain problems. And we should, like, so it's not to say neuroscience isn't useful. Neuroscience is incredibly useful. We just shouldn't kid ourselves about what it's useful for.
Brutal.
But I think that's unfortunately,
yeah.
that's brutal.
Yeah.
Brutal.
Not that brutal in my opinion, but this isn't a debate session, so let's actually have our main presentation instead of me interrupting.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
All right. I had a follow-up question with that. It's just real quick. I generally agree with what you're saying, although in particular with the sensory modality of smell, I feel like there's still a lot of value that neuroscience can bring to that, because I don't think we have any, at least at this state, we have any sense of being able to even contrive a function that would approximate how smell happens in the human brain. Whether or not that's actually important for, for a lot of modern day AI research is a different question. But I think for us to be able to get to that point, we still need a lot of neuroscientific research on that end.
Well, okay, I would agree with that. If there are parts of cognition where we have no concept whatever how to think about solving it, then new ideas from wherever, actually, like television engineering was for some other thing, or anywhere, could be useful, whether it's neuroscience or somewhere else. I think that's right. Now, in the case of smell, I think it's a little funny because I actually think that's not a computational problem at all, at least not the way humans do it. It's a hardware problem, right? It's like the way you think about those earlier evolutionary sensory domains is that really they have tons and tons of channels rather than a few channels and tons of stages and layers. And making the channels is a hard and like chemical engineering problem. So, like I know folks at like basically companies that try to work at like, essentially artificial, smell stuff. And basically what ends up being the case is that they start out thinking about ideas and algorithms, and then they just eventually they switch to, this is really like a hardware problem. What do we do? Basically. And so, like the mouse evolution of its odor sensors or something like that is like an incredible like biochemical evolutionary outcome attached to like a fairly dumb algorithm. And like, so it's like, it's not even an idea. It's not even an algorithmic idea at all, AI at that point. That's really, how would you replicate having incredible sensors that could be so generative and robust and blah, blah, blah. And that's a great problem. I think we already know in some sense the algorithmic idea, but with the hardware, okay, that's my understanding of that particular problem domain. But that's not to say your general point isn't true. I think your general point that like, if there were problems that we had absolutely no concept of how you might at all begin solving, an inspiration from any area, whether it's neuroscience or, electrical engineering or art or whatever is good.
Well, I think that your response to the interpretation of smell is actually kind of reinforcing the need for neuroscience, because a lot of earlier work thought that it was exactly that problem. It's a hardware problem of expanding the number of channels. But in more recent work, it's been found that it's highly contextual and that the actual underlying mathematics behind it isn't as clear as input to output, or even input plus some other component to output. It's just I don't know. It seems like it's something like the underlying function or even the concept of how the function works seems to be still kind of out of our reach, and
Well,
thus kind of
I'm
needing
far from an
neuroscience.
expert in that domain, so, like, if what I said earlier were still thought to be true, then that would be my answer, and maybe I just don't know. I mean, I talk with folks at like odor companies essentially pretty regularly, and this is what I'm still getting from them, is like they kind of not too interested. But anyway, it's like, as you say, maybe like that domain is a little different. But I guess I would be very surprised if it turned out that that function space is like so different from anything that like a neural network can produce, and it's just a question of maybe what you're trying to do with it. And like, they could be, yeah, you could be quite right that like, we don't know what the loss function is or something for that system. Now, I will say though that if you imagine you have some ideas of what that loss function is, here's two ways of dealing with that. You could try to do an experiment to see if your idea is correct. Or you could go implement that loss function on like whatever you thought was your hardware solution, like you just said, and see if it worked on the task of whatever you thought odor stuff did. And I bet that second thing is much faster, especially since odor work is so hard in the lab, right? It's hard to present the stimulus, for Christ's sake, right? So like, again, I think that like, if it's really like a conceptual problem of knowing what the loss function is, you can check it out fast without having to look at any data. If it does, in terms of its ability to do a task. Now, in terms of its ability to be like the brain, that's another question. But if we're talking about the ability of neuroscience data to help us get ideas to do AI, I still think that short-circuiting pathway is going to end up happening. I've never, like, I would love to see it not be like that, but it's I don't know. Anyway.
Sad but true.
Sad but true.
There's another question from Mike Dewey's. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I came in this late, so but I came in just about 10, 15 minutes ago and heard the exchange between Eli and Dan. And I just was going to say that like the jury is totally out about what to the extent to which neuroscience insight is going to change, in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years, or whatever, or allow us to produce algorithms that can do things anything like what the human brain can do for visual processing. So forget olfaction. I mean, just envision. Clearly, we're able to do a lot of things that the best current algorithms can't do, and we don't know what the difference is. And I myself, all of us are making decisions. How much time are we going to spend trying to understand the neuroscience, or doing experiments in neuroscience, or reading the literature in areas of neuroscience that we haven't already, just to mine all that stuff? And are the big breakthroughs going to come from that, or are they going to come from some insight that comes from fiddling around with an artificial neural net, or coming up with some insight based on math, or just trial and error, which is a lot of what's been driving huge jumps that have occurred in on the artificial neural on artificial neural networks over the past couple decades. I think the jury's out, and I think reasonable people can feel either way is true. The short circuiting argument, though, I mean, sure, once somebody hands you the insight, or once you get it from some neuroscience data, in principle, you don't need the data anymore. But I mean, people have had there have been discrete insights that have paid off over the past 40 years, but nowhere near as much as people thought they would 40 years ago. And I still think there's a lot to be learned by looking at visual neuroscience, just because we are so far from understanding how the brain works, or getting algorithms to, I mean, deep nets are very powerful, but my God, they take thousands of times or more the amount of data they should to be trained. There's all kinds of just fundamental, deficits in the most powerful current algorithms for analyzing images. And clearly our brains are doing it a different way that's more powerful. And if the right person takes the right data, they're going to find this insight. So even though I've personally chosen to stop doing experiments and spend all my time doing theory, I think there are very reasonable people who are placing their bets on analyzing visual cortical areas and see if they can figure it out. even though I think either road has been slow. There's been just a couple insights here and there, giving us a couple big jumps. Anyway, I'm just pontificating, but I'm loving this discussion anyway. But I'll let you go on with the presentation. Sorry.
Would you like to respond, or we could jump into the presentation? Up to you.
Well, I will say, I think that the characterization of the short circuit argument is wrong. The short circuit argument is this: you get your big data set, or whatever data set came out of your fancy, thoughtful experiment. Now you have to analyze it. When you want to analyze it, you have to come up with an idea of how to analyze it. You have to have that idea before you look at the data, because you can't just stare at the data anymore and get the idea.
I don't think that's true. I think that you can look at a Gabor, you can look at receptive fields and say, wow, they look like Gabor patches. What does that mean? And then realize, oh, maybe local orient, like you can get empirical evidence from the data, and it changes what sort of theory you might like. In fact, when I come up with a theory and I look at the data change, like immediately my theories are useless because the data don't look anything like what my theory would accept, whether it's I have some maximum information scheme or.
Okay, I think the Gabor example is like the 50-year example ago that was like that. But the set of the set of times where you can actually look at the data without having an idea, you like plot something on your computer without really having a very strong idea, and it tells you an algorithm, that's becoming like a vanishingly small case. And like, basically what I'm saying is that is not a workable strategy. It used to be 50 years ago, and we got a few insights that way. But now, what actually has to happen to analyze the kind of data that are going to push things forward, that would be able to be anywhere close to the forefront of pushing things forward from an AI perspective, is that you have to have an idea about what to analyze the data with that you think of in your head before you, like, without staring at the data. The staring at the data doesn't tell you what that idea is. And as soon as you've got that idea, here's the short circuit. Go try it on the test. Forget the data. You never had that do with the data in the first place at that point. Now, if you're right, if it were the case that you could like plot something in your computer from the data with like almost no thinking and no idea, and like you just see it and it like tells you an idea, that would be no longer, the short circuiting would no longer be the point. That would be wrong in that case. I'm just saying the thing that I just described is actually not at all what is going to happen. It has not been happening well for a long time, and is like implausible as like the future of how things are going to happen in like for AI in the future. It's just utterly implausible that some person is going to like, or maybe it'll happen like one set of every 50,000 like experiments, like, and like maybe one out of every 50,000 R01s will be like this. Okay, but like
bad ratio.
Actually, that like for any given R01, or like maybe even with a probability of like 1%, you're gonna like get this data that's gonna like somehow be strong, close to pushing AI. Then you're gonna like plot X, Y, or something in MATLAB, and you're gonna see something you didn't think of before, and you're like, oh my God, this is the answer. And then you go try it, and it's gonna change your ability to do AI tasks. I think that we have to accept that is like not possible.
I think that, I mean, anyway, I'm derailing this whole thing, but
I think this is an essential point. So this is the question Hadi asked me to talk about at some level. I mean, yeah, I got my PSI thing, but it's a great question, and I don't feel like you're derailing it. It's fine to talk about it.
Agreed.
I mean, I'll just say
the archive PDF exists. This is actually much more interesting, I think. So let's keep going.
Well, let me just say really quick. I mean, look, I'm putting my money where your mouth is, in the sense that I don't do experiments anymore. I do just straight theory. And that's partly because I feel like there's more progress being made on the AI side, even though I think there are plenty of insights to come from neuroscience that are going to pay off for us. But in terms of where I'm voting with my feet, with how I spend my time and what people in my lab spend their time doing. But at the same time, this 1%, I mean, if 1% of whatever year-long projects in labs produce fundamental insights, that's actually a good thing.
No, that's right. I think it's way below 1%.
Yeah, okay. You overstated the statistics.
Yeah, right. That happened 1% of the time is utterly implausible.
But I think that that's also true so I think that the insights that actually result in new understanding certainly are small on the AI side as well. what we see from AI is these occasional massive leaps forward, where partly from raccoon science, lots of people are trying lots of different stuff. There's some people like Hinton who are geniuses, who have great intuition, who can come up with something new, even if the theory's not worked out yet. And there's other people, and there's a huge crowd of them trying lots of stuff. And occasionally you get, a transformer or a GAN or, some big jump, right?
Well,
Which doesn't.
I actually think it's much more like 1 to 2% there. Right. And so
Yeah.
it works really well because it's like 1 to 2%. So I think it's qualitatively different, the level of which you can use understanding on pure AI than to try to have it go through the neuros route. So I mean, as I'm pretty much a practitioner of AI at this point, and certainly my CS students are. So let me tell you how it feels so different. Okay, which is that basically we do constraint-based reasoning. There's optimized systems. They have these 4 components: architecture, loss function, data set, and learning rule. Learning rule is always the same as basically, it's gradient set. So let's just put that aside for a second. So it's really architecture, loss function, data set. And we can reason about those so well that when something is not working, we can posit several theories, try them fast, and 1% of the time we figure it out. And that's 1% is great. Okay. And
I would agree. 1% is pretty good.
I think it's 1,000 times. It's 3 orders of magnitude better than neuroscience. I'm saying 1% is great, and it's utterly impossible for the neural route, but it's completely what every lab can do. Every well-resourced, decently smart lab can do on the AI side. You're right. There's a few geniuses. Okay. But actually 1% of the regular old AI people who are pretty good can come up with stuff that moves things forward pretty well. And so it's actually not true that there's been a few insights over the last 10 years. There's been I don't know, maybe 30 or 40, okay, that have really moved things forward, right? And maybe you're just not so aware of them, but and maybe they're not as big as Transformer, but they're you get regular insights that regularly move things forward, a decent amount.
Okay.
All the time, all the time, because basically there's lots of people doing it, and you get something good 1% of the time. And that's qualitatively different than what happens in neuroscience.
Maybe so. And I'll look. Mea culpa for being ignorant about all the AI literature for sure. I mean, my students know a hell of a lot more than I do about their area of expertise in AI, but the ones who study that. But in terms of the kind of insight, if what you want is the thing I mentioned a minute ago, I'd like to have algorithms that perform at human level at being able to not just identify cat in a photo based on who knows what it's really doing, but some smarter thing, or for that matter, training on 10,000 times or 100,000 times fewer data points, or things like that. That kind of insight, there's a promise from neuroscience that we can get that because the brains can do this, right? And it's going to be it's not going to be an incremental change, or the sort of, I think the 40 or whatever changes you're describing are not of the type, it's the transformer level, or it's the GAN level, or it's the original. That kind of jump is the question, right?
So of course the biggest ones are going to be few, but I think there are 40, regularly there are quote insights out of AI literature that are more powerful for their goal than anything that has come out of neuroscience in the last 25 years. And so yeah, you're right. They're all smaller than the transformer because there's only one thing that can be the biggest thing. And you mentioned the biggest thing. There's only one that can be that. But there's tons of stuff, not tons, okay, tens of things, okay, but that's a lot. Okay, so today I'm going to show you some algorithms that I think do a huge amount at changing the data curve, right? I think that the problem of getting algorithms that need 10,000 times as much data as a human to needing about 1 times the data of a human, that's the kind of problem that I'm going to solve without being a genius, by applying my understanding of thinking about AI. I think,
and importantly, you're not driven by the raw facts of the data. You're driven by this very high level observation of data efficiency. It's at the cognitive level almost.
I mean, but the idea that the data efficiency is a problem and that there are unsolved problems that could motivate us is totally true. So if you look at the thing that's on the slide right now, I think of the data efficiency, that's kind of a cognitive argument. You don't even need neuroscience to know that. And target setting from cognitive science to AI is a great path. right? It's like, yeah, we've got to solve. There are unsolved problems in cognition. Like among things, how do you learn from data and with the amount of data that a human actually has? So that the fact that target setting from problems, I think, is very important. And that's the sense, I guess, in which neuro or cog things still influence what we do is like we like try to pay attention carefully to those problems and not sweep them under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
I
maybe
think that's a good segue. Yeah. Let's get to.
So okay, let's talk about that.
Perfect.
One, deep trouble, the data scaling problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is exactly that issue. Okay, so here's this method, optimize network for performance and real world scaling from data, like compared with brain. And that's like done okay, and these are some old results probably everybody here is familiar with. Okay, here are, you can push those a little further than we did them. And actually here are some new results using video models, and that's fine. That's directly with stuff with Martin Schrimpf and student David Pound. But like there's this problem that was like bothering me from the very beginning, which was like, okay, this Hani mentioned this before, that basically there's this like supervision problem that like really was bothering me when I first started my lab, which was basically, oh yeah, here's an example. This was even before the data scaling problem. Like this was like back like when we were using supervised labels, which was even worse. Okay. And so it's like, okay, real data is like this. This is like stuff from Linda Smith, of recording what actual experience is like. So it's like, how are you going to use this, right? And so there's another example of this that was very powerful to me, which was back at the CogSci meeting in 2015. Mike Frank told me about this data set that finally got published in 21, which was SACAB, which was essentially, 3 infants aged 6 to 32 months, and you had like head-mounted camera, mono video and audio 2 hours a week. And so the question was, how would you use this to learn anything? And at the time, I was like, I have no idea, Mike, because like I only know how to solve problems with like tons of supervised data, right? So this is exactly the kind of problem that like it motivates research, right? Okay, this is great. Cognitive science is like pushing you to do something. It's not telling you how to solve it at all, but it's telling you what thing you need to fix. Okay. So it's gotta be some form of unsupervised learning, right? Was the thought. And the problem was that at that time, unsupervised learning in like neural networks or anywhere else kind of had been around for a long time, but it kind of didn't work. Okay. And so like, through like some stuff due to us and others, the community, something came out, which was these deep contrastive embeddings. And so here's an example. We had a student from my group, Chung Soo Zhuang, who did like a bunch of work on this and made some breakthroughs with this. Not like it wasn't like you could like look at the neuroscience data and build this, but you could like do the AI thing and try to solve this problem. So that's why many of these references are from like computer vision conferences or stuff, because these are like AI works. Okay. But that last one there, that's a PNS paper, that's actually about brain data. Okay, so this is the process. Solve the AI test, however you're going to do it, knowing that like what the problem was from the cognitive science, like kind of observation, and then see if it matches brain data. Okay, so he had this algorithm, local aggregation. I'm not going to get into the details of it. Anyway, at the time it was cool because it was the first unsupervised thing where you could like get a network that was better on categorization and ImageNet than like a supervised AlexNet. So that's just kind of an arbitrary point, but it was like, okay, the unsupervised networks were in the game at that point. And so then you could compare them to the data, neural data, not having said, like, we didn't use any neural data in figuring out this algorithm. I mean, this algorithm is not so amazing that I'm going to spend your time telling you about it. But like, the point was, it was pretty good. And so we were going to compare it to the neural data at that point, having first not thought of the data at all. And then, okay, it turned out that like it was decent. Like actually, finally, there's a red bar there. It was like as good or slightly better than supervised networks at predicting neural responses. Okay, and so like, okay, so what was the point of this? Well, the point was, well, we really wanted to attack Mike Frank's data. And so Chung Soo built this video version of deep contrastive embedding, which was something that got published again just in the computer vision literature back in 2020. And like, it processed videos in this self-supervised way, right? And it was like decent in the sense that it could do like various computer vision tasks. Okay, like better than previous stuff. And then the point was like you would take the SACAM data and you could sort of stick it through this network. Right? You could just take those videos and put it through this network. You didn't have to have any labels. And you could ask how well it did. And like, okay, actually it was all right. In the sense that like it produced neural responses that like were about as only a little less good. Okay, let me put some asterisks there. Not quite as good as running it on the, well, you could use this. What I told you a minute ago is with static images stuff from ImageNet, if you took the actual ImageNet images, you would get, but put them through self-supervised networks, you could actually do better at predicting neural responses than the supervised networks. And here what I'm telling you is that if you take the data from the head cam and put it through the self-supervised network, it's almost as good as doing it through ImageNet, but not quite as good. That's what the result was. So like basically the point was is that like, you know, video learning, self-supervised video learning from like natural head cam data was stronger than some alternatives, like older implementations of predictive coding or something. But there was still a gap between training on ImageNet and training on the natural data. Like the training on the, not the labels though, but just the images of ImageNet was better at neural predictive networks and doing tasks and all that than the networks trained on SACAP. That is to say, trained on the actual headcam data. Right. So the gap is not that huge in this data, but it was still galling, right? And like I had this debate with my student essentially as to whether we should publish this as a negative or a positive result, because okay, it was way better than some alternative theories in terms of its ability to make predictive models, but like there's still a gap that seemed weird, which was that the naturalistic data led to worse models of neurons than the ImageNet data. So we knew that there was something not quite right there, right? So, okay, so how do we figure out what was not right? Okay, so part of the problem was that it was a little bit confounded with the amount of data, which is I told you that basically it was like 2 hours a week or something before. So like we needed to go from this amount of data to like, well, that's what we have now roughly, to like this amount of data. Okay, we now have a little bit more than like a child year. And so there's this great project that was led by Bria Long, who's now got her own group at UCSD, which was the Baby View project, which was collecting a bunch more data. So we could deconfound whether the problem with the algorithms was just that they didn't have enough data, or whether there was something wrong with the actual algorithm itself. Okay. And so actually here
there's a question.
Yeah, sure.
Mike.
Yeah, sorry. So in the last slide, it said accelerometer. So I didn't understand that. You have data about proprioception. You know where the subject is looking left,
Well,
right, up, down.
it's accelerometer data. So, you know, of course, you don't know where they're looking, but you know
Oh,
something about where their head is relative to the Earth.
you know changes in the angle, right?
Yeah,
So,
well, it's not quite as nice as that, but it's something
oh,
like that.
and the reason I'm asking is that, and I was going to ask earlier, but I want to interrupt too much. I'm going to interrupt so much as is. But the task that you're trying to solve isn't just an image task. Then you have some secondary information about self
Well, I haven't
motion.
told you about using this data at all. Okay, I've just told you about like what the data is. So you could ignore, in principle, the accelerometer channel.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
This just
Thanks.
happens to be what's in the data.
Oh, well, but that's a different problem though, right? And it's
Well,
more
the
like what the
data.
baby's actually solving. Part of the reason that the baby's able to do it, right, is that it knows something about self motion when it interprets presumably, right? And if your algorithm is using that, that's great. It's just, but it changes I mean, it's
Yeah.
closer to the task I think the baby's actually doing.
Yeah, I think you're right. So like it could be like, okay, let me tell you this. Let me get like
Sure.
a few slides further and I'll come back to what you were just saying. Okay, so the point is basically, okay, there's this data, and now you could like ignore the accelerometer channel for just a minute. Okay, and you can try to see how well, like, okay, now I got more data. We take the best existing algorithms. So that went from like local aggregation or whatever it was to like at the time we did this now last year, like 9OV2 or whatever. And you know, like see how good the new data is. And so like at like, you know, 500 hours you're here relative to humans. And then at like 1,000 hours, you're here relative to humans. Right? So like finally we're getting to get a clear picture that like, you know, like for example, like even if you had like say 11,000 years of data, you would like finally be getting maybe close to human performance on this thing. So this is exactly the problem you mentioned. Right? It's like maybe you can do it like humans do it in 11 years or a bit less, not 11,000 years. Okay? This is exactly the issue, right? So and this was like true for other tasks, like depth estimation or whatever, semantic segmentation. Okay, so now, let's say, okay, we think it's not just that you need more data, right? It's not like that other algorithm with more data is going to be enough, but maybe you need other kinds of data, like other modalities. And what you just said is an example of other modalities, right? And it happens to be available in that data set, so maybe you could show that. Or maybe you needed things like audio-visual or like language or whatever. Or maybe you need like a deeply different kind of algorithm. Like it's not like you take Dino V2, but apply it to video plus or like images plus camera data or something, right? Angle head change, then suddenly it's going to work. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Here are different hypotheses. Okay. So we're mostly going to focus on the second one because I'm going to tell you basically proof by example. That's enough. Okay. It turns out that like actually you don't need other modalities, just other ideas. Okay. So let's see, in terms of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore this other earlier attempts at curiosity stuff just because of time. And I can come back to that if people are interested. Okay. What I'm going to start doing, and just relative to the problem that I've just posed, like one possible solution idea. Okay. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to tell you some kernels of this idea. So first of all, where do we think visual cognition arises from our insights in cognitive or neuroscience? Okay, so like in a way, this is an inspiration. Okay, so like in visual neuroscience, we know there are these visual intermediates, right? Or at least this was how people thought about describing the visual pathway for a long time. Actually, part of what I was saying earlier was that this description was not that useful from the point of view of like making a lot of progress at describing the visual system. And in building all the previous models of the visual system that I built, I kind of threw out all of these things and thinking about it. I never conceived of this because it was not that helpful. But it is truly that people think about it. And indeed, there are lots of named visual intermediates, both in sort of vision science and in like computer vision, like old school computer vision, especially. So like things like low-level stuff like contours or like all the way up to like 3D volumes or affordances and stuff like that. And with other stuff, lots of stuff in between, optical flow or 2.5D sketch or whatever. And so you might like assemble these, like a kind of my caricature of how like some folks think about using these to like make a working idea is that like you assemble them in some pathway. Like first, maybe you start with optical flow, and then that allows you to do segmentation, like you learn which things move together. And then somehow you figure out how to lift segments from 2D to 2.5D or 3D shape, which then like you can build scene graphs from, which allows you to do like intuitive physics, right? So this is kind of a caricature of how you would use visual cognition intermediates to like think about how animals learn or do like some visual stuff, right? And it's kind of a synthesis in my mind between David Marr kind of thinking and like Liz Spelke and the other like developmental scientists who developmental cognitive psychologists that folks probably know. So like this is one concept, right? But of course there's this other idea, which is like also like almost the opposite of this, closer to the thing that I was saying earlier, which is this bitter lesson. I mean, folks here have probably heard of the bitter lesson, right? So it's nothing special, but like at this point, but it's basically the TLDR is like basically as much as possible, fancy ideas are not going to help you. Large and simple models with good data is enough, right? And so like basically the thing this thing is very non-bitter lesson. And like, so bitter lesson kind of a little bit of the opposite of that. Right, and then finally, I'll give you a totally different kernel, which is like what's happening in LLMs, which is very instructive and interesting. So let's talk about LLMs for a second. What is an LLM? Okay, so an LLM, I'm going to tell you, and this is probably very clarifying, is these three weird like acronyms in my view. This is my personal idiosyncratic way of thinking about LLMs, which is, okay, firstly, they have a large pre-trained model. Okay, that's the term that like for the base model that like my colleague here likes to call them. Okay, so for example, like GPT-3 is a pretty good next word predictor. That's a base large pre-trained model. Okay, and then there's actually maybe equally importantly, there's a generic task parameterization. Okay, so like what does that mean? It means that basically there's a way of stating all the tasks in your domain in the context of like one single framework. So like, what is that? The base version of this is basically, and this was the amazing thing actually about GPT-3, was that it was sort of, so here's a solution to all language tasks. Have a next word predictor and put the definition of task in the context that the next word predictor is using. So it's like, it's almost trivial. It's like basically, if I say I do task X, here's the definition of task X, then you put that in the context and whatever comes next is the answer, if your predictor is correct, right? So you can think of like the power of GPT-3's result was not that like the main thing that was interesting about it was the fact that you could drive the contextual next word prediction loss low enough such that the thing that I just said actually works for lots of problems, right? It's kind of a tautology that if it worked perfectly, it would be a generic thing. But like the interesting fact is you can actually make it work in practice, right? And then actually based on that, you can build inferences and construct new kinds of inference patterns to allow you to make better models. Okay. And then finally, underlying because of this stuff, there's a self-improvement mechanism. So like basically, I don't know if people are aware of like self-taught reasoning. How much is that in people's like wheelhouse here?
Not much.
Not much.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but that's actually like the basis of like modern language models. Like when, you know, like I would say that like the reason why GPT-5 is as amazing as it is, or like Claude Code or whatever, is through insights that have happened in the last few years, far beyond the transformer, just as important as the transformer. Okay, maybe they're just not as familiar to the like community at large, but they're very familiar to people working on these problems. And one of them, like every one of these things, is like is an insight of that form, especially like the fact that you can build inference things because there's a generic task parameterization, and then a self-improvement mechanism where basically what you do is you take the inferences that you figured out, try new ones, check them through some verifier. That's an interesting problem. How do you verify it? And then basically do RL, you know, to improve and you can actually continue to train models on the outcomes of those traces. So there's a kind of self-improvement mechanism. And that like has led to the big, huge leap that we see. Like it's not like GPT 5.4 is based on just doing bigger predictor models. That's actually that's like a very small fraction. It's totally not, oh, you know, like we just scaled it and that was it. Like maybe 3 years ago, Andre Karpathy would have said, yeah, scaling is everything. But I don't think anybody in AI would have said that what the history of the last few years and the major advances in this domain that have happened were due to just scaling. They were due to ideas and thinking and understanding of how reasoning works that the people who were building these models could capitalize on. Am I saying anything wrong?
No, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And also, like, I guess one other way to think about it is like, sure, in some limit, if you had unlimited compute and unlimited data, maybe you could scale to anything. But what these things really do, these advances, they like bend the curve of how much you can do with any given amount of data and
exactly.
compute budget.
Exactly. It's still the case that even this is too much in humans. Like you need more orders of magnitude than humans get to do language. But this bends the curve a lot from so it's like, you know, if you wanted to just do GPT-3 and get the power of current models, you would need bazillions of orders of magnitude more data than we have. But the fact that there were insights about how to do like inference chains or inference structures and then use them to build self-improvement through like verifiers and stuff, and like that cycle, that like self-improvement cycle actually is an insight, and that insight bent the data efficiency curve by many orders of magnitude. Okay, so like while still not being enough. Okay. But anyway, the point is that actually this is almost completely difficult to do in vision. Well, why? Okay, so let's start about what we do in vision. So in vision, we often think of things in this kind of representation learning paradigm. Okay, so you train a large model, and then you build like a probe. It's like a linear probe or something, right? And this is representation. You have a representation, and then you probe it. And the problem is that like actually this is far from what you see. It's not nearly as good as what's going on in the language domain. Why? Because where do the probes come from? And where do the labels for the probes come from? You still need, like, even if it was self-supervised representation learning, which was basically what the earlier generation of contrastive learning stuff that I told you about did, how do you get you still need labels for making the probe, right? So this is like representation learning, which is mostly what we think of as in vision. And it's like the main way that people who do like visual neuro AI like use their models, but also not just visual neuro AI, just regular visual AI, right? Like this is kind of bad compared to the situation with language because, well, okay, there is a large pre-trained model, like whatever your big vision model is, but then there's no generic task parameterization, and therefore there's no self-improvement mechanism, so you don't actually get a cycle of improvement, right? This is actually like fairly problematic, deep issue with what's going on in vision, or in like maybe even more generally, areas where you don't have great tokens, right? Language is great because it's got great tokens, but plenty of things like vision have bad tokens because what pixel patches are like not great tokens, right? And so like, as a result, it's pretty hard to figure out how you build a generic task parameterization, how you therefore catalyze visual inferences in some kind of like complex but generic ways, and then like get self-improvement out of that. So like, yeah, question?
Yeah,
Oh, no, I basically gonna finish. I'm saying, like, we have to go beyond this is basically the key insight. This is another kernel of ideas about how to go beyond this.
so how did like the modern diffusion models not fit into this? Because I feel like modern, like doing this generic task thing, they're just denoising stuff. You can use that to do a whole bunch of stuff. You can put language in there. You can generate these rich images. Like,
But you certainly can get a large model, but like, if you want to take a diffusion model and do another task, you've got to like, how do you do, whether it's a diffusion model or any other vision model, like to do something, like, let's say you want to get like depth or something out of a pixel diffusion model, you got to label it with labeled images or something, or like you want to get categories out or whatever you want to do with the model, right? It's not like there's an equivalent of like a visual task like a visual language that like you use. It's like whether it's diffusion or not, whether it's generative, being generative model or whatever, like like actually the best models for like doing vision stuff tend to be not the diffusion models, like in general, like stuff like Dino, for instance, is not, that's actually good. But even if you had a diffusion model, it doesn't change this story in any fundamental way, I don't think. Right?
There's
still have to probe it. It's still representation learning paradigm.
There's another question. Allison, go ahead. I think you're muted.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. Just to bracket, there's something important about the language case that makes it different from the vision case, which goes beyond just the tokens. It's not just language. It's not like the language input that, say, kids are getting. It's text that people have placed on the internet. And that's like a completely different, when people talk about data, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question about what's data when data has been generated by human beings who have all these other kinds of representations and knowledge precisely for the purpose of communicating to other human beings on the internet. That's not the data that say a vision system is getting, and it's not even the data that a kid is getting. And we keep sort of forgetting when we say this is a language system or that it's working so well because we have more data, that's a very special and peculiar kind of data.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think a way to put what you just said in the context is that the language situation is not fully understood.
Mm-hmm.
But it's certainly, but what I'm saying here is it's a better understood than the vision situation in a certain way. So like, yeah, you're completely right. Like, I mean, of course, if you really want to understand about language and humans and learning, it's like, how do you get those text tokens from the actual data stream? Like, there's all sorts of questions around that. Okay. But like, once you get the text tokens, you can do this stuff. Okay. Mm-hmm. So like both what you just said is both true. And also it's the case that there is this insight here that's happening in language, right? So in some sense, the vision situation is worse than even the language situation, which has problems like which is incomplete as an understanding, like you said. Mm-hmm. Right. So
I do think it's important to emphasize that this data is data that humans and adult humans and humans who can write and humans who know how to use the internet are generating, again, specifically with the intention of communicating to other humans. That's just so different from, and I think it's a really interesting question about like when you have a system that's trying to solve a whole bunch of other problems, and then on top of that, it develops ways of communicating information about what it's done to other agents.
Oh, yeah. No,
that's just such a different.
It's a different, there's many things that make the language case not exactly like a completely solved thing by any means. So yeah, this like little discourse here was not meant to say, oh yeah, the language model is perfect, but it's like, it is meant to say there's something going on there that's an interesting kernel of an idea that we should try to understand in vision. Now I'm gonna hopefully, by the end of telling you what we did do in the vision case, get you to a place where we can say, okay, now let's actually apply this to real, visual human data. And actually, they end up with a result there that I think is stronger in some way than what is happening in vision. I mean, in language, for the reasons that you said. But yeah, this is not to say the language case is completely solved. Just to say there's something going on there that's interesting that we haven't had access to. Okay, so now let's talk about what we actually did. that like put these things together. And so this is what probabilistic, where probabilistic structure integration came from. So it's basically a cycle that's got 3 components. And so what I'm going to basically do, well, first I'm going to tell you who worked on it, who actually did it. So one of the main persons here is Clement, and that's why I wanted him to come with me, is because like he's really the leader of this project. But lots of other folks from my lab contributed as well. And so, you know, like there's a long paper about this, which you can read at your leisure if you were so inclined. Normally I don't like to put out like basically monographs or something because like they're long and whatever, but I thought this case was an interesting one. And so we did that, and you can go read this in great detail. And in fact, like I do think it would repay your effort to read section 6, the discussion, just on its own as like a thought piece. Okay. But anyway, there are some normal conference papers that are like basically generated from this, like that do the usual thing of like saying, oh, we got state-of-the-art results on X, Y, and Z. Okay. Because this talk is really not focused on that type of thing, I'm not going to belabor those individual papers. But what I'm going to do is now start telling you about the idea. Okay, so what is the idea? It's got these 3 components. The 3 components are, I'm going to tell you about them. Basically, I'm going to spend the rest of this time telling you about them. Okay, so the first component is like a learned probabilistic graphical model. Okay, the second component is the exposure of low dimensional structures in the data through counterfactual programming or through approximate causal inference. And then finally, a mechanism for self-improvement by integrating structure back in. Okay, so like I don't expect you to like know what each of these 3 things means as I've stated it here. I just put them up on the board, and like now I'm going to tell you about each of them, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of the time on, basically. Okay, like trying to get into the details of what these things mean so that I can communicate that, basically. And I really appreciate the length of this venue because like we can actually talk about them in enough detail that maybe it'll make sense. So okay, there are 3 components. Let's go through them. Let's start with number 1. Okay, so step 1 is basically this learned probabilistic graphical model. Okay, so basically here's an image of, this is a screen grab from a YouTube video. I mean, it's not the highest resolution video as you've ever seen, but anyway, this is what real data looks like oftentimes. So fine, so you might want to know from your model of, and I'm going to just make claims about things, which is if you're building a model of the world, you might want to know what might happen next from this. Okay, but lots of things might happen next. For example, this might happen next, or like that might happen next. That might happen next. There's multiple different plausible futures. Okay, right? So how would you get a model that can capture that? Right, and now I'm going to tell you the form of a model that is good at capturing that. And so let's call it psi, and it takes 3 inputs. Okay, the image, some bits of like patches from. You should think of those tokens as patches, x I naught through x ik from the next image, and a new location in the next image, ik plus 1, one where you don't know what the next image looks like. And then what this model is going to learn to do is predict the probability of whatever the different possibilities are at that new location, conditioned on the previous image and whatever number of tokens you get from this image already. Okay, so this is, I know this is like a little formula here, but this is like the core idea, which is the model takes in some data about the state and predicts probabilities of the undetermined part of the state. Okay, and these probabilities are probabilities over different possible patch tokens at that location, ik plus 1. It can work on an arbitrary number of tokens, or as stated, I'm asking this function to work on an arbitrary number of tokens. So it could be 0. It can be totally unconditional. And then what these patch tokens are basically discrete codes, so representations of a small patch. So roughly something like, roughly something like the outcome of like doing like a sparse autoencoder. Okay, so you basically have your codes, local codes, and then you like predict what the local code at a new place is, given what you've seen some of what the past. Okay. Okay, so for example, like that red box is highlighting something, it's like part of the racket, and like actually like, you know, the like thing that could be there is like those different things are possible. And those are just different probabilities over like these little texture like patches. Okay, so that's like another way to say this is like, let's rip off that third argument and just put it as like an array. The function psi takes an image, some tokens for the next image, and then makes a map of probabilities of things elsewhere. Right, and of course, you're not actually predicting the ones you're given as conditioning, so I'm graying those out. So I'm just trying to communicate what the form of this predictor function is. This is the core essence of it. Okay, so let me rephrase what this is. Okay, imagine that each of these patches is a variable, a random variable. Okay, what this function is describing is a learned probabilistic graphical model that basically allows you, for any one variable in the system, to predict the probability distribution of that variable conditioned on any other variables. That's the essence of why it's like a PGM, is because it allows you to predict the distribution of any one variable conditioned on some sub-collection of any other subset of variables in the system.
The distribution is over pixels per patch.
Well, in this case, it's patch, it's patch.
No, but
codes.
each patch
It's a code.
can be
Distribution over codes.
okay, a discrete number of codes.
Codes, yeah,
Okay.
it's like on the order of tens of thousands.
Okay.
Yeah, so that basically it's like imagine a sparse autoencoder. It's in this intermediate state. It's like, thinking of like Bruno's work, right? It's basically like, it's like the different, is there an edge at this angle?
I see.
Basically, right? Okay, so now the question is, how do you, so that there's actually a general form of problem. I've told you a vision problem, but actually there's a very generic problem, which is how do you learn a PGM? Right? I mean, that's always been a big problem. That's why the PGM field kind of got stuck, because like it's like hard to learn that. Okay, it turns out one little trick will do it, and this is like a deep insight that Clement had, which was basically that like you can formulate, there are these things called basically pointer tokens, okay, which is basically like a token for the location. And if instead of this like image-like thing, you basically do a sequence where the sequence is interleaved pointer tokens and values, pointer value, pointer value, pointer value, pointer value, pointer, P at the end, then actually the whole problem of learning that PGM boils down to the sequence problem of learning this sequence design, as long as you're learning it in random order. Now, why is random order important? It's important because you want to be able to condition on any subset of the variables. And as long as you have random order, then it basically means that you get to have the problem formulation, the sequence problem, forces you to learn to predict the conditional distribution of any given token based on whatever else you might have given me already. And so it turns out that basically you can take the like PGM problem and reformulate it as a causal mask sequence problem. So basically that is to say a GPT. Right, and then like all of a sudden, these incredibly powerful scaling tools, code tools, and like actually scalable architectures apply. And so basically, this is how, and this is like in some sense a deep but very simple insight, you can learn a PGM through like formulating it in this way. So this is a transformer formally, like psi, but it is not a vision transformer. It's a GPT, which is quite a different architecture in a way. But like can apply back to the vision problem in this way. Okay, so I think there was a question and I want to answer that before I go forward.
Yeah, so just a clarification question. So I guess this is a more simpler implementation question. So how are the tokens in the dictionary created? Are they like pre-trained? Are they learned jointly with the rest of the model? And part two of the question is how should we think of these? Because if you have a dictionary of words, then it's pretty intuitive. Like you have a fixed set of words that you're recombining across all of language, for example. But in this case, is this like what do these like tokens correspond to? Are they like similar visual features across different contexts? Yeah, just.
Well, okay, let me frame the question by saying it actually turns out that the tokens are not that, it's like a kind of uninteresting answer. Like almost many different things will work, okay? A good way to think about it is that the tokens are these small local discrete things, and it's like a code for which local, like the set of vocabulary elements that covers the space of small local RGB patches is actually pretty small, okay? And how do you get them? Well, that's basically Bruno's insight, which was essentially you build a sparse autoencoder, and so that's like one of the things is dominant in any one code is dominant in any given little patch, and that's good. It's basically like that. This comes from that idea. So it's pre-learned, but it's very small and simple. Okay, and it should basically intuitively, it's like, is there an edge at this location of this frequency and orientation, or a color block or something? Okay, it's that. It's simple like that. Okay, I think that for some
Thank
reason
you.
this thought that I wanted to raise my hand. Okay, so that's basically what it comes down to, is that like actually in some sense it's meant to be like, this is like, you know, these are not global interesting tokens. These are dumb local tokens. Okay. And so like the point is that that's what's being predicted. Okay. And so here's this efficient way of learning the PGM over these tokens.
What is randomized? It's a patch.
The order, yeah, the order of the patches.
Order of patch in each frame is randomized.
Yeah.
Based on the conditions on the prediction set.
Well, because it's a sequence model, those are the same. You know how like sequence to sequence, like GPT these causal models are trained is basically you've got a sequence and then you have a way of basically setting up a causal mask so that essentially for every I, you can train the problem of I plus 1 as a function of 0 through I.
Yes.
All simultaneously.
Yeah.
So the random order means that like basically you're training problems of any amount of conditioning of all amounts of conditioning at the same time on each exam. That's actually a key point because that makes it efficient.
Okay.
That's actually a really deep efficiency. Okay. But anyway, the point is that, I mean, in some sense, that's why language models scale. Okay, that's why like GPT for at least many purposes is better than BERT. Okay, so please correct me if I'm
Yes,
saying
no,
anything stupid.
completely.
Okay, so you know, okay, so basically, okay, so here we have this this thing, and so now, okay, it's like doable in the sense that you can train like a 10B model on a chunk of YouTube, given like slice of like a, okay, it's a little more than 2 weeks, but it's like some amount of time on a TPU. So I really want to acknowledge the TPU Research Cloud folks here because they enable us to do this stuff. Anyway, the point is that you can train this kind of model. We did it. And now I'm going to tell you some outcomes of it, some inference pathways that it does. So here's what unconditional prediction looks like. It's basically where you put nothing in the buffer of patches from the next frame. And so here are 3 things. Actually, the things I showed you before were not stills from that same video. They were just generated stuff. These are literally 3 seeds of the predictor. And this is what it looks like in the unconditional case. So for example, here's another case of cars on the highway. And the point is that like in each frames, cars are moving, but the different seeds have the different cars moving at different rates. So you don't know that. You don't like, there's uncertainty as to that, but you know that they're going to be moving. Or here's another example of billiard balls. Billiard balls are an interesting case because they're like, you know, uncertain events, but there are very discrete things that can happen.
During training, do you have variable context length?
You mean number of frames?
Or number of patches, you know, the set that is empty here, that set can have variable number of members, right?
But like, sorry, you can.
Well, I think it's the same point that Dan was mentioning before,
Yeah.
because it is autoregressive, you're sort of like incorporating every variable length of conditioning in like a single forward pass.
Ah,
It's like always, you know, like in the language model,
Yeah.
it's like all the words up to this
Yeah,
one,
right.
the next one,
Right.
yeah. So similarly here, you basically see, you know, some like one case where there's absolutely no conditioning with the next frame, one case where there's 1 patch, 2 patches.
You get them all at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's why you can do variable numbers.
Yes,
Which is
yeah.
critical for having a PGM, which
Yeah.
is you can like condition on any number or type of variable.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have a fully connected graph. At any given instance of training, there's a subset of that graph that is sampled or something.
And that can, well, basically you sample subsets of all sizes at every training.
At every training.
Which is actually why it's so efficient.
I see. Okay.
Okay. So, okay, so now let's do some conditional prediction where you like stick some patches into the slot. Okay. Conditioning on ground truth patches. Okay, so here's an example of a boy riding a bike. And like, I'm going to give you some patches from the next frame, a couple patches from the next frame. And like those patches tell you that the whole boy has got to move forward. Because like, you only need to see 1 bit of the boy to know that he moved. So therefore, the whole boy's got to go together. And here's like a different seed. So the boy always moves, but like what's different is like, if you look at the background, the mural like is like not determined, right? So the model dreams up different possible continuations of the mural. Okay, but the boy's always moved because that part is like pretty, like, it's like determined. Once you know that the shoulder moved, you know the whole thing moved together. So think about that for a second. Basically, the object concept has emerged here because there's no prior for objects, but the statistics of knowing how to deal with the conditioning give you the sense of where the objects are. Okay, so that's what the actual ground truth frame 1 is. So it's like just a different mural continuation, essentially. Here's another example, camel going. And so like from one frame of camel, you don't know whether or not what it's doing is cantering or walking. But anyway, if you know that the thing moved forward, the object has got to have moved forward in either way, but it could have cantered or walked to get there. Okay. So, you know, this is like, I've shown you some examples of conditional prediction. Okay, we'll come back to the power of that in a minute. Let me tell you about counterfactual prediction. Okay, that's where the stuff that you stick into the conditioning slot is made up and potentially extremely low likelihood. Okay, so it's not sampled according to any distribution. You break the distribution, you break the lengths of the distribution, and you put whatever you want in there. Okay, like little interventions. So for example, here's a situation where we got this image of the Mini, and like we say, okay, actually, I didn't mention camera motion. Here, we have camera motion in this data, so like kind of like we're using it the way Mike suggested, actually. But anyway, the point is that in this counterfactual, we say this patch has to move down. And also the camera has to be fixed. That's actually important. If you don't fix the camera, then what the model will do is like just rotate the camera down to be consistent with that camera motion. Okay, but actually, once you fix the camera, then what ends up happening with that is this, because this is like kind of the only plausible like continuation of what will happen if you like tell me that the camera is fixed and yet the little bit of the car moved down. Okay, it's like it has to do something weird. Okay, it preserves the car to some extent, but it's got to do something weird. Oh, here's another one. We moved this patch up. Got to create a shadow. It's got to move the car entirely. But like this is like counterfactual. You can see like I'm like doing events that are extremely low likelihood, right? I'm giving you examples of things where like the thing that's in the little prompt is not what would happen if you were to be sampling from the distribution unconditionally at all. And yet, you know, you kind of get plausible outcomes. But here's another example where basically you move the can up by moving the top up. So it moves the whole object. Or, and this is a kind of a cool example, is you fix the bottom patch and you move the top down. And what could happen? Well, I guess the can was empty and it got crushed. Okay, so it's like this is a very implausible event, but it's not impossible. And the model has got to explain the data away in some way. And this is like what it does. Okay, so it's like saying, I'm going to tell you something that probably didn't happen, but if you did, tell me what you think. Like, what does it mean? What is the consequences of it? And here's like the examples. So you can see like visual quality is pretty good. You can like do stuff with the world, even if it's like low probability. Okay, here's another example, maybe a little more realistic of what you would use it for. Here are 3 frames, actual frames of bowling, excuse me. Here's some 3 frames of bowling. So like now I give you 2 ground truth frames and I tell you to predict what's going to happen next, and it knocks the pin down just like it's supposed to. So the predicted frame shows the pin getting knocked down, although there's like some small details about what's behind the pin that are like, of course, hallucinated, because what else was it going to do? And here's another example where instead I move the ball counterfactually and generate the next 2 frames. And in this case, the ball goes between the pins and it does not knock down the pin. Right? So this is an example of how you would like use a combination of like factual, or that's to say conditioned prediction, and counterfactual is to say like, I guess, sticking in untrue things into the conditioning slot to like reason about what things cause what. Because like this is like the experiment you would need to do to show that like the bowling ball knocked down the pin causally. Okay, so here's an example of that visual reasoning idea, built based on a model of the kind that I just told you. Okay, so basically the claim here is that the difference between like these various conditioning configurations end up encoding very different quote tests: unconditional, conditional, counterfactual, etc. All right, so now I think that I'm going to move on, if that is okay with people, to talking about the second idea, which is the exposure of low-dimensional structures in the data. Okay, so like this is a cycle. I'm now telling you about the second piece, and the key thing is doing kind of approximate causal inference. So I hinted at how you would do causal inference. Now I'm going to show what it's useful for. Okay, so the core idea is this. Okay. Properties of interest, or intermediates, structured prompts comparing factual and hypothetical are intermediate vision ideas, are structured prompts comparing factual and hypothetical or counterfactual predictions from the model, which are essentially causal inferences, or I'm going to call them approximate causal inferences for some technical reasons. Okay, so basically the claim is that properties of interest, or intermediate structures, are causal inferences in the predictor that I just told you. So of course, if you have a PGM, you can do causal inference in it. And if you have a learned PGM, you can do like approximate causal inference in it. And the claim is that those approximate causal inferences are actually useful intermediate concepts. Okay, so like what is a causal inference look like? Basically, you make an intervention. You have your data. You make an intervention by putting delta on it. You compare the ground truth to the intervene prediction. You get the counterfactual effect. And then you identify which variables have changed most. You basically argmax over variable space. So this is like saying, how do you, this is like a generic algorithm for this basically, this is like an approximate version of the Perl idea of how you might get causal inferences out. Okay, so now let's do this in practice. Okay, there's lots of named visual intermediates. I'm going to claim they're all, or maybe many of them anyway, are very simple causal inferences in the underlying psi model that I just told you. Let's start with optical flow. Okay. On the left is an image, xt, and on the right is a perturbed image, xt plus delta, where three little, like, you know, I don't know, perturbations have been made. A red square, a blue square, and a green square. Does anybody not see those? They're there, like these little perturbations are there, right? Okay, so now, they're there. Okay, so basically, let's forward the under the predictor what's happening. And now we have two things, the clean prediction, psi of xt, and psi of the xt plus delta, the counterfactual prediction. Okay, and let's look at the difference. This is the counterfactual effect. It's basically a blank image with two little blobs. Okay, a green blob and a red blob. Why? Well, okay, so the red blob moves because basically it was on the back of the horse and the horse moved. And the green blob didn't go anywhere because it was like the background was stationary. Okay, and the blue one disappeared because it was occluded. Okay, so basically what this is saying is optical flow is the argmax of that predictor, is the causal inference in this case is which point in frame 1 plus which motion will cause the corresponding point in frame 2. So I've just told you essentially how to construct optical flow as an approximate causal inference in this predictor. In a like, not only this is not only self-supervised, this is like zero shot, right? It's like saying I'm defining the concept of optical flow, thusly. And it corresponds to what people's intuitive notion of optical flow is. Okay, so and in some sense, this resolves the hard problem of unsupervised flow, which is low contrast regions. Like imagine you're trying to do flow on a low contrast region. You don't know where each point moved because it kind of looks all the same. And this like basically says that, okay, if we counterfactually change the contrast locally, or kind of putting a little tracer in, and then using our model of the world to understand where the tracer went, make a prediction of where the tracer went, now you can like do like you can just, that difference is what the flow was. Your estimate, your notion of what the flow was. Okay. Okay, this is basically like this is a very generic construction though. And at every point, this leads to really good flow estimators. Okay, that's like why there's papers like the ones in Neuros and stuff. Okay, and this is what they say, it's not like, not only unlabeled, right? It's like zero shot. You don't have to do anything, you just extract this. Okay, and like you can hear just some videos showing it does good. Okay, but this is just eye candy for computer vision purposes. Here's another one. Okay, fine. So it turns out that you can do this for lots of other concepts as well. So like, for example, segmentation or like depth. Okay, like how does the segmentation and counterfactual work? Now the perturbation is in flow space. Okay, you say, I'm going to move a little point. Now tell me what else moved, what other flow there was. That difference is the object. That's basically what Spelke's like notion, the object is the thing that moves together. But now it's like a zero shot extraction from the underlying model. And you can do the same thing with lots of other tests. Here I'm showing you with depth and stuff. And that leads to like good extractions of meshes and things. But anyway, the point is that like lots of visual intermediate concepts. We've shown these ones in red with various papers, but like probably other ones too, can be extracted by doing this approximate causal inference in the learned PGM. Okay, by, you know, basically you've got, well, there's a formula for approximate causal inference, and the only thing that's different for the different ones is what is the perturbation? What is the intervention? Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically that's what this point is. Zero shot counterfactual approach, right? Okay, so now let's talk about step 3, okay, which is the mechanism for continual self-improvement. So it's the step 3 of the cycle. Okay, so now here's a method. I'm going to tell you a method, and then I'm going to tell you the principle. The method's very simple. You generate new tokens from the step 2 stuff, You put the new tokens in the sequence, and then you keep training. So it's as simple as a method as you could possibly imagine. You basically, from extractions in step 2, you basically get new tokens, right? Like, okay, I told you can extract flow. Well, you can have flow tokens in basically the same way as you had like RGB tokens, or you have like segment tokens, you can have segment tokens, right? It's basically the same concept applied almost the same way. You extract them, you put them in the sequence, then you keep training. Okay, so let me show you what this means in principle. Okay, mixed sequences of different token types can generically embed many tasks. This is the practice, this is the method. Here's the idea of why it's good. Okay, so let's say your original RGB model was what I showed you before. Okay, it was basically RGB 0 to RGB 1. The C is camera, like I told you, we also have camera motion in there. But like the point though is anyway, you predict RGB 1 from RGB 0. Okay, this is what the original thing is. So now I'm saying, look, let's take some flow tokens and stick them into the sequence. You don't even have to restart the model. You just keep training them all. Okay, and now the model adapts to learning this new concept, which is flow. Now, why is this good? Okay, so mixed sequences of different token types can generically embed many different tasks. So like, okay, do I have this here? Okay, yeah, so here I'm going to tell you what they are. So let's take this sequence, this RGB flow RGB sequence. Okay, if we are interested in predicting the last third of the sequence, the RGB part, from RGB 0 and flow, that's equivalent to flow-based rendering. Meaning like, I'm going to tell you what you saw and how it changed, how it moved. And you tell me what the consequences of the motion are. That's the last part of this sequence. But now let's actually go earlier in the sequence, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what the flow tokens are as a function of RGB 0. Just ignore the last bit. Now this is motion probability prediction. It's like saying, if I see an object statically, what things are likely to move and by how much? So those seem, like in principle, like extremely different tasks, because one of them is like a very high probabilistic prediction about motion, and the other is about what happens when you do motion, how does it render? But actually, these are really the same problem. They're just different parts of the sequence. Okay, so here they are in practice. I've got some initial image. Here is what it's like. I basically, I didn't tell you this, but we trained the model with those tokens. And so now this is like an example of a prediction for motion, which is like the objects can move. That's a sample of the motion prediction on those images. And then that's what the rendering looks like. Or you could do a different sample, which gives you a different motion, which renders thusly or thusly, right? So this is like basically saying that these different aspects of the visual cognition problem are basically just different components of this sequence. Okay, here's just a re-representation of that idea in an even more confusing graphic, which basically says that many different apparently distinct tasks can be understood as like just different portions of this mixed token sequence. Okay.
Can I try to rephrase it to see if I got it right? So if you look at the visual world, it's comprised of things like static frames and how they transform, how they evolve. So there's these two distinct and orthogonal dimensions. Therefore, they're sufficient for the model. If you put the flow back in there, it's all you need basically.
That's what I mean, because there are like lighting changes and other things that you
Yeah,
don't
but
have. So
I see.
it's not actually the rendering part
see.
is not totally deterministic.
Mhm, mhm.
And like different probability distributions, even with like flow token, will be like the possible ways in which things could have changed that.
I see.
A little bit like it's actually a lot of it is flow and RGB 0 are a lot, but not everything.
Right. Flow is not the only type of transformations that can change a scene. Okay, I see.
So like, flow is applied on all the pixels of frames. If you pan the camera, you have to like imagine like new things, like plausible continuation.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's another point. This is just like there's like hallucination. You actually can't get away from having to have a generative model, even in the case where you have like a flow conditioning, because like as Clement said, if like something disoccludes, you've got to know what you think is behind it, what you imagine might be behind it. Okay, anyway, the point though is that these different components of the sequence lead to these different tasks, and as a result, models have very enriched control surfaces. So now, for example, you can make direct flow counterfactuals. Like let's say you want to move something. It's really annoying to specify that to move something by specifying an RGB patch motion. Because actually, like let's say you move something, especially if it's moving like an out of plane, then the transformation on the pixel sucks, actually, to even get the counterfactual. But in flow space, building the counterfactual is much easier. You just say, put this flow here. Okay. It also makes the sequence make better predictions because you learn more efficiently. And finally, the enriched sequences lead to better extractions. So basically, there's a cycle here. Like, as you have new things, you can extract new things and other things better. So like what this is basically, as I say, okay, now, like instead of describing only probabilities of RGB, I'm going to tell you probabilities of motion, right? And I can construct new things, like for example, the probability of motion. You couldn't do that in the pure RGB model, because what would you compute the probability of? The pixel patch? I mean, you could do that, but it wouldn't be anything useful. Whereas like here, you can actually compute the probability of motion, and that like tells you like in a very fast parallel way, like if I look at a scene, what can move and what is likely to move and why. Okay, and that then in turn allows you to do things like construct new tokens like rigidity, which is like rigid things are things that move. When one flow token, you get motion on the whole thing deterministically. But on the deformable thing, what basically ends up happening is there is like probabilistic motion that goes across the object. So like here's a new materials extraction concept. Okay, a zero-shot definition of essentially something that's probably like Yamins or bulk modulus or something. But anyway, it's an interesting idea. And you can also come up with concepts of like shadows. I'm not going to get into depth of that right now. Or transparency, which has to do with probabilistic idea of depth, right? Like, are you sure that there's depth in the glass or not? Both of those are reasonable interpretations, and the probabilistic concept can allow you to extract that idea. And then you can sort of put these types of things together to do visual reasoning pathways. So like some colleagues here of mine developed this task here at Berkeley in Alyosha's group, and others developed this visual Jenga notion. So you can like actually solve visual Jenga pretty well with this model. Like, I'm not going to get into the details of exactly how this works, but basically is you discover the object and you figure out by doing a sequence of very simple generic reasoning operations of the kind that I've just told you, effectively the graph of interactions between the objects. Okay, so you can solve visual Jenga in a generic way. And so anyway, the point is that like you can like take this idea, these three concepts, and do a bunch of stuff with them. I've told you the three concepts, how they fit together, and how they give you this sort of cycle of improvement. But of course, the tokens don't have to just be vision. Like they can have text tokens, so that's a VLM based on this, or it could be robotics data, action conditioning, or neural data. In fact, you could like you can take neural data and stick it in as a token. But I'm not going to talk about the details of it, but I will tell you a little bit about Kai's paper. I think Kai forwarded it. So basically, the idea is something like what I just told you was applied to the SACAM, or now the baby view data, and it was trained with one epoch. So just one epoch through the data in order, right? And so what you can do is like plot various quote developmental trajectories. It's a little bit grandiose to call them that, but it's just like you can see how the model makes things happen over time for like optical flow or segments or whatever, and like the whole spectrum of things that I've just told you. Okay, so optical flow is basically constructed in that counterfactual program the way that I just told you. And it turns out that like, you know, you get it very well. And in fact, with one epoch of the baby view data, you can learn a model of flow, or a model whose zero-shot flow extraction is like basically as good as state-of-the-art supervised things. So now we're no longer in this regime of sucking with this type of data. And like the same thing can happen with the depth perception. There's various notions of depth perception. You can pull them out and like basically like it's a hypothetical stereo. Okay, so it's like you imagine what the thing looks like from a different view. Okay, and that allows you to like construct the zero-shot notion of depth perception. It's kind of like, you know, implementing how you might imagine a baby would do it from looking. And anyway, it turns out that like gets solved almost immediately after the data starts. Okay, so this is a very efficient way of extracting this problem because it's zero-shot. It's basically like you don't have to learn a probe at all, right? And the model is kind of set up to support these inferences very efficiently. And then some of the same thing is true for object understanding. By object understanding, what I mean is basically just stealthy object boundary detection. Okay, now it's slower, right? This is a harder problem for the model to learn than the very basic like depth detection thing that I showed you a minute ago. But it does get there very well. And then like here's some other things like intuitive physical predictions. So this is stuff like basically if I push the thing, what will happen to it or if it's support, like if I push the top, will the bottom move, or I push the bottom, will the top move, and whatever, force transfer. And again, it turns out that these models are very effective at learning these quantities. Like the zero-shot like predictions about these sort of simple intuitive physical concepts arise very, very effectively. Okay, so the bottom line is that it learns pretty efficiently from baby data, enough so that it has the chance to scale like human learning. Okay, so back to the problem that we originally started talking about, it's like, okay, I mean, I don't think that everything has been solved here or anything, but at least it's the case that like the type of data you actually get and the amount that you actually get, the considerations that I've told you here produce very efficient learning. Okay, so if we go back to our like PSI, like our like language model analogy, it's like, what's the large pre-trained model? Oh, you know, it's the PGM thing. And then what's the generic task parameterization? It's basically inference chains, causal inference chains in that model. And then finally, the self-improvement mechanism is just token sequence enrichment, right? It's like, it's a very simple concept. There's basically a generic parameterization of causal inferences. The outputs of the causal inferences generate tokens that you use to self-improve. And so, like, maybe this is how we do this more generically when you don't have good tokens. Okay, so like, and now, okay, so like, I'll just close by talking about Allison's point, right? So years ago, I used to work on, I thought a lot about artificial curiosity signals. And I basically stopped working on it because the model, like the concept of it, I have a picture here of an agent. And the agent has a world model and a policy model. And you basically, what we would do would be like, we would try to use whatever the best world models of the time were to like figure out how to make inferences about the intrinsic reward function. That's to say the like artificial curiosity function that would lead to behaviors that would be like natural that humans would do, like which things you would find interesting or whatever in any given environment. And this really didn't work very well because the world models sucked and the RL models sucked at the time. The RL stuff sucked. And now basically what I'm saying is, okay, the PSI thing allows you to have a world model that doesn't suck for these purposes. And so now I've gotten quite interested in this again, actually, which is the idea to revisit the curiosity concept. And in particular, it's like the question that Allison was asking was like, where do those language traces come from? Right? To begin with, is something that we should be able to deal with much more efficiently here. Okay, so basically, claim is that the better physical world models allow you to formulate intrinsic reward functions, that is to say, artificial curiosity functions that are much more powerful than we had before, hopefully, and then revisit this concept. Okay, so yeah, that's basically what I had. I think that like we're close to the end of time, but also if there's some questions, it's a good time for that too.
Thanks, Dan. Questions, Mike?
Oh, I was applauding, but I will ask a question, which is, so that's a great talk.
That's right.
I'm wondering, so I'd love to know if something like this is going on in the visual system. So there's two ways I can imagine testing it. One is having people, like seeing what mistakes people make and predicting the next slide or whatever, and see if they agree with the kind of mistakes this makes compared to actual video. But I don't know if that's going to get at it so well. Another is having them watch a video and say whether it's real or not, and see whether the mistakes they make tend to be more aligned with things that are plausibly generated, but generated by this kind of a. But I don't know. Have you thought about comparing against data?
Yes, I mean it's a sort of like you know how I think that those are going to be easy tests because the model is trained on the actual distribution of stuff, and so like it's possible that the error, like I think humans are very good at this type of thing, up to the stuff that like is basically undetermined. So my guesses will be that it's like it won't be a very strong test because like humans will be like good and then they'll be like unsure about what's behind something, and the model will be good and on the stuff it can see and then unsure of what's behind something, but will make plausible predictions and stuff. So I feel like where will the really strong test come? Okay, so now let me show you what I think. I actually skipped over this section earlier, but it really. Okay, I will be done in 2 minutes. Okay, so this is a really strong test because basically, yeah, I have this in here, but I skipped over it before. This is really related to the artificial curiosity signal. Okay, so I didn't talk about this, but basically, we had this attempt to like use physical models to like make predictions of artificial curiosity signals, blah, blah, blah. And there were like all these various artificial curiosity signals. And we tried them and we basically got human data on like 1,200 examples of like scenarios and making the humans rate like what they found interesting and useful. And basically that was it led to a very reliable human signal. But all of the curiosity signals were very, very far from being correct. Okay, we had no concept of how to get a good model of what like human like interestingness was going to be about. And so what I think might be a really strong test was now if we take the model and try to generate predictions of interestingness, do we get much closer to human ratings on something like this? With maybe like, I don't know, empowerment or something, which we can compute in the model. Okay, so like I think that like that like basic errors in like forward prediction will be like it'll be doable. It'll be a weakish test because in some sense the model is trained to be good at that, and probably humans are good at the parts that they can observe. But the place where in the past we've been terrible, where there's like obviously a big gap, would be something a little bit more subtle, which is like what does your brain tell you you think you should be interested in and why? And I think that this would be a really strong test. So I don't know whether it'll work or not, but it'll be an interesting investigation.
By the way, I bought us a few more minutes, so we have like until 12:10. So Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is really, really fascinating and really lovely work. One thought I had is I didn't quite get how you were doing the interventions, right? So the idea is you're perturbing this and then seeing what the outcomes are, which is how you do causal inference. But it's basically, I think from what you said, that it's basically the coder, you're the one who's doing the interventions. How is the
You're
system
basically asking,
deciding
where
on
do we
that?
get the interventions from? Okay, there's two things that
Yeah,
you can interpret your question as. One is, how do you do the intervention? That's
right.
generic. That's the step 1, 2, 3 thing. Once you have the perturbation or the intervention, the Perl algorithm carries forward. Okay. But the interesting part of the question you asked is, where does the perturbation or where does the intervention delta come from in the first place?
Right.
How do you decide what interventions to do?
Exactly.
Okay? So that's an incredibly deep problem. Okay,
Right.
that's basically so like I think of that as like the so-called auto discovery problem. So
Right.
I don't have that written down here actually as a thing, but it's like
Yeah.
okay, so let me maybe this is somewhere in one of these other talks that I have. Like I don't know why I left this out, but like basically yeah, so let me answer that this way. All of the various little computations we talked about naturally form a directed acyclic graph of interacting structures.
Okay.
Right, so each node arises as a little counterfactual analysis program. So now it's implemented as this simple differentiable search. Okay, so now that's okay. That's back to what I've Spelke-Mar-Sutton synthesis. That's why I mentioned those two kernels of the idea. I don't know why I didn't bring them up. But anyway, the point is you're asking, can these be parameterized and auto-discovered?
Yes.
Is
Right.
there a DSL for causal inference? And is there like a generic verifier for utility of the auto-discovered concept? And if you could do that, if they can be parameterized and auto-discovered, if you could find a DSL for like causal analysis programs and a verifier for program utility, then that's now like a Darwin Spelke-Mar. Okay. And that would be like the ultimate type of algorithm. And I think that like that's the frontier of this type of concept.
Right. And so here's a sort of suggestion, and it speaks to the suggestion about how you're going to get curiosity involved in this too. The human ratings of interestingness, I think, are not, they're confounded with all sorts of other things about humans or rating. But I think infant interventions, and this gets back to actually having the kinesthetic information, might be really interesting to look at. So, one of the things that we know is from the time they're born, they're doing eye tracking kind of interventions. And by the time they're, 4 months old, essentially their whole life is just doing experimental interventions. And it would be really interesting to see if you could connect the experimental interventions with the reshaping. Dan, I'm sure Lisa Feigensen's result, which is just a really simple one where, you show the baby a violation of a certain kind of principle, and then the baby, if it's a violation of support, the baby picks up the object and drops it. And if it's a violation of solidity, the baby bangs it on the high chair. So, like real actual actions, goal-directed actions might be functioning like, okay, this is an intervention as opposed to all this other motor stuff going on.
That's a very natural thought. I totally agree with that. So like that is that, I mean, I think that the policy of how you discover real life during real like inference time, the right interventions, that's to say that auto discovery algorithm is, as I say, it's like the algorithmic frontier here.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like, once you had it, if you had a thought, then you could go back basically and like, make a comparison to the like human data of which actions were taken or,
Yeah.
what did precisely. And like, ideally you would get way better predictions than we have now on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying in the Pearl framework, one of the things that had always struck me as being missing was an account of experimentation, and there were a couple little things around the edges that tried to do that, but we don't have a
Where do you
good.
get the perturbations, the interventions from you want to try in the first place?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly
Well,
it. So that's a
good.
key problem.
Okay, that's the next thing to do.
That's the next thing to do. Okay, thank you guys so much. And like I'm glad we had the opportunity to have a kind of high level conceptual conversation about the future of neuro AI as well as fairly detailed discussion of this particular research idea. So thank you so much for having me. That was great.
Thank you so much for coming. This was amazing. All right, so